This video was originally going to be a summary of recent work that my Year 10s have been doing on the transatlantic slave trade as part 2 of the Migration, Empire and Peoples topic. It would also be some use to Year 9 who were about to start part 2 before school closure due to the coronavirus. I'm going to go through some of the work that I've set recently along with an exam question, but I'm also going to add some of the events that have been taking place recently around the world. This video will not be a potted history of all of racism that's ever existed, but I also aim to discuss and make some sort of connection between the past and what's happening now with the Black Lives Matter campaign and the recent murder of George Floyd. Hopefully it might open some discussion about where education should go in the future. Let's start with a typical starter. Here are some of the key words with their definitions that you will need to match up. So feel free to pause before I reveal the answers. In the very early days of empire building, England rivaled other powers such as Spain and France for land and economic domination. During the Tudor Age, the major powers gained a lot of their wealth from stealing from ships from other countries. In England, some of the top men in the navy and members of Elizabeth's government were given permission to do this. They were therefore no longer pirates, but known as privateers. Many pirates during this period found riches in smuggling enslaved Africans into the Spanish colonies. During the reign of Elizabeth, John Hawkins was central to the development of the English Navy. He was a talented naval commander and a wealthy trader with contacts all around the world. However, Hawkins is recognised as England's first major slave trader and a pioneer of the triangular trade between England, West Africa and the Caribbean. His success encouraged others such as Sir Francis Drake to smuggle goods into their colonies or plunder Spanish settlements and ships that left them loaded with gold. As the 16th century went by, the English realised that it was more profitable for them to run plantations rather than continue with piracy. From the plantations, commodities such as tea, coffee, tobacco, cotton, sugar could be produced, shipped back to England and sold as profit. Here we have 6 statements. See if you can decide whether they relate to either piracy or plantations. As a challenge, choose the most important reason you think that the English decided to replace piracy with plantations. Here are my answers, so check them against yours. Also have a go at the challenge if you have not done so already. So why did the plantation owners want slaves? Well, the Caribbean islands would have been very hard to live in for some English settlers who wouldn't have been able to have coped with the weather or new diseases. England then began to import indentured servants who were desperate and would pay off their voyage to America by working for 7 to 10 years. After that, they might be free and would have been paid wages. In 1619, England started to import enslaved Africans into its colonies. They were cheaper because they had no rights, would have worked for their whole lives, and even their children would have been slaves too. So this saw the start of the triangular slave trade. Manufactured goods like tools, nets, weapons were transported from Britain to Africa. Slaves were transported then from Africa to the Americas. This journey was known as the Middle Passage, and conditions were so appalling and congested that diseases were quickly spread and many slaves would die before arriving at the destination. When they did arrive, slaves were auctioned and then sold to the highest bidder as if they were objects. The slaves would work on plantations, picking the sugar, cotton and tobacco and transport it back to Britain. Historians have been discussing for many centuries why it was black Africans that were enslaved and taken to America. Well, the racist belief that black Africans were inferior to white Europeans has existed for centuries, so racism is often explained as the answer. It may have also been less of a risk to try and enslave non-white, non-Christian people from a second continent, Africa, and transport them to a third, America. Many white Europeans did not consider Africans as equals and therefore did not care for any rights they may have gained under the ancient African empires. The powerful and wealthy kingdoms of Mali, Kush and Oil are often overlooked, but hopefully my Year 8 students will remember these from the first term and the work that they did on Emperor Mansa Musa. Hopefully some of my Year 8s will remember the fantastic work they did in the first term on the ancient African empires. They also studied many sources on the two different types of slaves that existed in America at the time. The field slave would work on the field or plantation, often beginning before sunrise until the dark at night. Their work could be very physical and often in the scorching heat. The house slave would work similar hours, cooking, cleaning, looking after children, maintenance and any other job around the home that they were told to do. Some of my Year 8s might remember the details of the way the slaves were brutally treated from some of the sources we looked at in the first term. Now for our next task, we have 8 types of people that would have been involved in the slave trade during this time. Read through each of them and decide who you think might have gained the most from the slave trade. I'd be interested to see what some of my students think about that. We must also remember at this point that where the protests are taking place at the moment tend to be the big towns and cities that profited the most and were built largely from the profits and revenue collected from the slave trade. Now my Year 10s will recognise this question set to them recently. Those that have not attempted this question, pause the video and take time to do so now. It shouldn't take you more than 12 minutes. Remember, this is only an 8 marker. You may be familiar with this chart that I often show students when answering the significance question. For a top level 4, your answer needs to be concise, detailed with own knowledge, and discuss short, medium and long-term impacts of the plantations. I will try and make another video soon about Britain's next chapter in the slave trade and also British colonialism and migration to Britain and throughout the empire. Due to recent events, there have been calls to change the curriculum in order to make sure that we include this part of Britain's past. Many see the link between the treatment of black Africans in the 15 and 1600s to the systematic racism that exists in society today. When George Floyd was killed by 4 American police officers, you may have seen many people comparing this case with the 1955 murder of Emmett Till. For those of you that don't know, Emmett Till was a 14-year-old boy that was accused of flirting with a 21-year-old married woman called Carolyn Bryant. He was said to have wolf-whistled her and called her baby. Her husband Roy Bryant and brother-in-law abducted the boy from his great-uncle's house, beat him, mutilated his body before shooting him and sinking his body into the Tallahatchie River. His body was discovered 3 days later. His murder received wide-scale media attention. His mother insisted on an open coffin at the funeral to show the world how badly her son had been beaten and the brutality of the killing. In the September of 1955, Bryant and his brother-in-law Milan were acquitted of Till's killing. They both since publicly admitted to killing Emmett Till, but were protected by double jeopardy, which means you cannot be tried for the same crime twice. The case of Emmett Till is often seen as the beginning of the civil rights movement and prompted inspirational leaders such as Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. to respond to inequality elsewhere in the USA, such as the segregation on buses in the South. The case of Emmett Till called for all black people in America to unite. You might be able to see from this Anne Moody account of the Emmett Till case that some young black Americans were starting to resent older black Americans for not taking action. Many of us knew about the Black Lives Matter campaign before the murder of George Floyd. The movement became a hashtag on social media following the shooting of Trayvon Martin, a black teenager from Florida, in 2012. His killer was acquitted on the grounds of self-defense, which caused outrage, and the Black Lives Matter hashtag started to increasingly appear on Twitter. Please feel free to pause to read the background to Black Lives Matter. You will notice that this movement is not new to the state of Minnesota. These protests were a response to the shooting of Michael Brown that occurred on August 9, 2014 in Ferguson, Missouri. Brown, an unarmed black man, was shot to death by a white police officer. The disputed circumstances of the shooting and resulting protests and civil unrest have caused significant controversy in the United States. The "I can't breathe" slogan that is used to symbolise police brutality towards George Floyd echoes the "hands up, don't shoot" that trended in connection to the shooting of Michael Brown, the implication being that whatever crime Brown was believed to have committed, he was no threat to police officers, he was submissive in his response to them, and did not deserve to be executed. Racially motivated murders and institutionalised racism have unfortunately been a part of British society too. The case of Stephen Lawrence is a prime example of this. Stephen Lawrence was murdered in South East London in 1993, and it took weeks for the police to arrest the 5 suspects, and charges were soon dropped. It would be another 19 years before 2 of the 5 suspects were finally convicted of his murder. That double jeopardy law mentioned earlier for the Emmett Till case was also law in Britain too. It had to be repealed, which means partially removed, in order for a retrial and for new evidence to be emerged and for justice to be finally served. I hope this video has been of some help. I know I've not been able to give a potted history of all of racism that's existed through time. It seems very strange being back here after a few months, but I hope to see you all back here soon. Take care and stay safe.